All right. Well, let's get things started. And let me welcome you with a good afternoon. My name is Jay Naklis, and I'm an associate consultant here at Coleman Insights, welcoming you to our Outside Thinking for Podcasts webinar. So one thing to note is that although you will be muted during the webinar, you're going to notice in your panel that there's a button to raise your hand and ask questions. You don't have to wait to ask questions. If something pops in your head anytime during the presentation that you want to ask, just type your question in. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to take some of your questions. So make sure that you stick around. Our Coleman Insights presenters are John Boyne and Warren Kurtzman, as you see there on the screen. So let's get right into it. Here is John.
Hey, thanks, Jay. This is John, and I'll be starting things off. And then in a few minutes, you'll be hearing from Warren. We really appreciate you joining us today. If you're not familiar with Coleman Insights, a quick word about us. We're a research firm that helps media companies build strong brands and develop great content. Now, sometimes when we say we're a research firm in the media business, people think, you're a ratings company? No, we're not a ratings company. We're kind of in the business of helping companies understand the whys and hows of behavior. So when things are good, why? When things are bad, why? How can we improve? That's the kind of work that we do. And we use market research tools such as surveys, focus groups, one-on-one interviews, content testing, etc., to interact with consumers and learn about their tastes, perceptions, needs, and behaviors. And we specialize in the audio world, so podcasts, streaming audio, radio. So today we're going to cover three areas. First, we're going to define this concept of outside thinking. Second, we're going to apply outside thinking to podcasts. And third, we're going to share some new podcast research along the way that supports the things that we'll be talking about. So there are two general ways of thinking about your product or service: inside thinking and outside thinking. Inside thinking is how those inside the industry tend to think about that product and service. It's kind of a inside the walls of the office, inside the boardroom perspective of the product and service. And kind of when you hear people talking shop in the halls of a conference, when you hear people talking around the water cooler about their business, oftentimes that's inside thinking, inside discussion. But inside thinking can be problematic because it doesn't always reflect how your consumers see your product or service, or how your potential consumers see your product or service. Thus, inside thinking can lead to false assumptions about the consumer, which can lead to bad decisions. So we oftentimes encourage our clients to take an outside thinking perspective. Outside thinking is how everyone else views your product or service. It's putting yourself in the shoes of the consumer. So we oftentimes find that inside thinking and outside thinking can look very different. So let's go through some examples of differences between inside and outside thinking in the podcasting world. So inside thinkers may believe that everybody knows about and is listening to podcasts, whereas an outside thinker would believe that we must teach people about podcasting. An inside thinker may believe that content is king, whereas an outside thinker would recognize that content and branding is king. An inside thinker may believe that success is measured by downloads, whereas an outside thinker recognizes that success is measured by satisfied listeners.
So let's tackle those three things that outside thinkers believe that John just discussed. And we're going to approach the first one, which is this idea that you must teach people about podcasting. Perhaps the best evidence of our need to do this is that thousands of people every month enter this phrase, "what is a podcast?" into search engines. In fact, according to Moz, this exact phrase is searched for between 30 270,000 times each month. Now, this is not really surprising because while podcasting continues to grow quickly, new research we fielded in May with a nationally representative sample of 18 to 64-year-olds revealed that only 27% of them listen to podcasts each month. In a typical week, only 21% of American 18 to 64-year-olds listen to podcasts. This is in sharp contrast with, for example, hamburgers. While there are literally thousands of places in this country you can go to get a hamburger, virtually everyone knows brands like McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's as places they can go to get one. Similarly, while there are plenty of places online where you can watch a video, virtually everyone knows that they can go to YouTube to watch a video. However, in the podcasting space, there are not only dozens of options to turn to for finding podcasts, there is no one brand that has universal awareness like McDonald's does in hamburgers or YouTube does in videos. So when we promote podcasts with generic statements like download wherever you get your podcast, we may be only exacerbating the problem. Our suggestion here is that when you want to encourage people to listen to your podcast, you need to give specific places where they can go to get it. And if you have a website for your podcast, which we strongly suggest you do, provide step-by-step instructions on how to listen. We've learned this with many of the radio stations we work with who are trying to increase consumption of their content via smart speakers. The stations who are being outside thinkers when it comes to smart speaker strategies are encouraging their air talents and also airing frequent promos by saying things to their listeners that are very specific, like, say, Alexa, play WXXX, or hey, Google, play KXXX. They're telling people exactly what they need to do to listen to their radio stations via smart speaker. Podcasters need to do the same thing. They need to explain to people in very specific detail where they can go to get, download, and listen to their podcasts. Another item that was on the list that John just shared with you a moment ago is that outside thinking also understands that there's this combination of great content and branding that is crucial to being successful. Outside thinking podcasters are always going to be thinking about how they can do both of those things well. Now, if you're a podcast creator, you're obviously going to want to be on the right side of this axis. You're going to want to deliver a great in-the-moment content experience to your listener as often as you possibly can. But if you're an outside thinking podcaster, you're also realizing that you need to have a strong brand in order to be successful. What you ultimately want to do is be doing things that put you in the upper right-hand quadrant of the graphic that you see on your screen here. And what we mean by that is that every minute that people are listening to your podcast, you want it to be a positive content experience for them, but you also need to be doing things at the same time that strengthen your podcast brand. At Coleman Insights, we call this concept the Brand-Content Matrix. And it's this idea that you not only want to deliver great content, but you also need to be growing a strong brand. And that's really difficult in an environment like podcasting, where there are over 700,000 active podcasts. Building a brand in this space is really, really difficult. Now, one of the first things that you need to do in order to build a strong brand is to let people know that you exist. You need to develop some reasonable level of awareness that your podcast is out there. Because when your typical podcast listener is searching for podcasts that she wants to listen to, you need to be one of those few podcasts that she's likely to be aware of. And the challenge of doing this really came through in some of the research that we conducted back in May that I referenced a couple of minutes ago. When we conducted this research, again, with 1,000 18 to 64-year-olds who are monthly podcast listeners, we asked the question that you see on the screen. Please tell us the names of as many podcasts as you can think of, regardless of whether you listen to them. Now, you may have seen these results in the press a couple of weeks ago, but I want to share them with you in some detail and really demonstrate the challenge that the podcasting industry faces with the development of brands. So when we asked the people the question about all the podcasts that they were aware of, there was only one podcast that had a high level of unaided awareness, and that was the Joe Rogan Experience. 14% of monthly podcast listeners are aware of Joe Rogan on an unaided basis. All of the other podcasts that showed up in the research were dramatically lower than that. Serial in second place at 6%. Then we had The Daily, My Favorite Murder, and This American Life, each at 4%. And the only other podcasts that had unaided awareness levels of at least 3% were Fresh Air, Stuff You Should Know, and Pod Save America. So this idea of building a strong brand in the podcasting space is incredibly challenging when some of the biggest names in podcasting can't even get into the double-digit range. To further highlight the challenge here and the challenge that podcasts face with getting a lot of consumers to be aware of them, I'm going to put these numbers back on the screen again, but now I'm going to add some additional items. Because in many cases, when we asked people to tell us all the different podcasts they were aware of on an unaided basis, they didn't even identify specific podcasts. Some of them, for example, just said some platforms. 5% mentioned NPR. 3% said ESPN, YouTube, or Pandora. And then taking this a step further, some people didn't even mention platforms. They just mentioned types or categories of podcasts, with 4% of all consumers saying, in answer to that question, tell me all the podcasts you're aware of, regardless of whether you listen to them. 4% just said, I listen to music podcasts. 3% said sports or true crime or comedy or news. So one of the strongest messages that we'd like to get across with our presentation today is while you need to be focused on delivering great content, and we're going to talk about that in some more detail a little bit later on in the presentation, the other key to being successful with a podcast is you need to build a brand. And in order to build a brand, you need to think like a marketer.
So the first step toward thinking like a marketer is really understanding what your podcast is all about and how to communicate that. In other words, what is your elevator pitch? Now, if you don't even know your own elevator pitch, your podcast may be a bit of an unfocused mess. But typically the challenge is that the podcast maker kind of gets it, but has challenge explaining that to the audience. And that can undermine your potential because people need to know, what is your podcast about? Why should I listen to it? What makes it unique and memorable? And if the target audience doesn't get what you're all about, they're not going to listen. They're not going to remember you. They're not going to spread the word about you. Now, one of my favorite examples of the elevator pitch is what Malcolm Gladwell does on every episode of Revisionist History. Let me play you a clip.
My name is Malcolm Gladwell. You're listening to Revisionist History, my podcast about things overlooked and misunderstood.
My name is Malcolm Gladwell. You're listening to Revisionist History, my podcast about things overlooked and misunderstood. So why does he do that? You're already listening. He's already got you. Because he wants to build a brand. He's thinking like a marketer. He wants to make sure that you understand not just what that episode is all about, but what the series is all about. He wants to ingrain the brand in your head. He wants you to remember it. He wants you to come back. He wants to tell your friends about it. So he's thinking like a marketer and building a brand by communicating that elevator pitch. Now, once you've got your elevator pitch down, consider the specific brand name of your podcast. Is the brand name of your podcast searchable and memorable? Let me give you an example. I like Stranger Things, the show on Netflix. I wanted to find a podcast talking about Stranger Things. So I go into my podcast app, or I go to a search engine, and I'm just starting from nowhere, starting from searching for Stranger Things podcast. and a lot of different options come up. The one that caught my attention, Dungeons and Demogorgons. If you're familiar with the show, you'll get the title. But to me, it was memorable. It caught my attention. And then when I listened to it, I really liked it. So the fact that it wasn't a generic brand name was a good thing because it helped catalog this particular podcast in my mind. There are a lot of things that I listen to and I couldn't even tell you quite what it's called. I could describe it, I could maybe tell you the host, but it's hard to kind of remember because they're just not well branded. And maybe that's fine if I'm subscribed and I'm listening to them. But if I'm really trying to develop as a fan, if they're trying to develop me as a fan, having a memorable brand name would be great. It helps cement it in my brand name, my brain, and helps me communicate it to other people who might like it. Now, branding goes beyond elevator pitches and brand names, though. Remember, we're in the audio business, and great audio brands have unique, memorable sounds. Sometimes we talk about how great audio brands can be recognized even without words and without their names being said. They use audio signatures like mnemonic devices and jingles to really help brand themselves with the target audience. Here are some examples. "60 Minutes." Enthusiasm. And in the podcasting world,
coming up this season on Serial.
So look, the people behind these shows could have said after the first season, let's mix it up. They could have said after the first episode, let's mix it up. This is stale. Let's do something different. 60 Minutes, good show, but that clock ticking, let's do something different for season 2. Curb Your Enthusiasm, the bump, bump, bump song, kind of fun, but let's mix it up. Let's be more creative than that. But would those have been good decisions? No. The consistency is beneficial. The repetition of the branding is beneficial. They found something that works and it helps cement their brands in people's minds. Now, as we continue to think like a marketer, ask yourself, does your podcast have a consistent structure? So consistency and consistent structure help build brands of any kind. So let's think about Starbucks. You can close your eyes and imagine a Starbucks, right? You know the menu, you know the layout of the store, you know the colors, you know the font. Can you imagine if instead of that consistency, if every Starbucks was instructed, do your own thing, be creative, have fun, just sell the Starbucks coffee, but do your own thing, have your own colors, have your own layout, have your own font, just tweak the menu, but just sell Starbucks coffee. That probably wouldn't be a good thing. The consistency of the experience is part of what makes it a strong brand. So in media, you can apply this consistent thinking in a lot of different ways. A consistent release schedule so that people can kind of get used to when to expect your program and build their habits, build it so it kind of fits their lifestyle. A consistent length, a consistent structure within each episode. A good example of this is Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. The show has been on for years, and it is the same basic format every time. Bill starts each show with a monologue, then he walks over and sits down for a one-on-one interview, then he gets up, walks across the set, sits down with a 3-person panel for a discussion. He takes a little break, does a comedy bit, then a 4th panelist joins, they continue the discussion, and then he cuts it off and closes with new rules. very consistent structure that works for his audience. In the podcasting world, a good example of consistent structure is Business Unusual with Barbara Corcoran. This is a pretty short podcast. She'll spend roughly 4 minutes on the main topic of the episode. She'll go to a commercial break. She'll come back and spend roughly 4 minutes answering listener questions. Now, another tool for consistency and structure is the use of benchmarks, signature benchmarks. That would be a recurring segment or feature. So on the screen, for example, you see Jimmy Fallon writing thank you notes. Every Friday night, Jimmy has this segment where he writes thank you notes. And it is always done the same basic way. It's the same process. He always asks the audience for permission. Do you mind if I write some notes? He always has interaction with the keyboard player. It's the same music. He even has the same hand motion to bring his pen down to start writing. And the consistency and repetition is a good thing. The audiences like it. He's found something that works, and they like that they can get that with some frequency. Now, signature benchmarks are also used in the radio world. So Elvis Duran in the morning show is famous for a segment it calls phone taps. It does it with frequency. This is a prank phone call feature. The audience loves it. It gives them that benchmark with regularity. It's so successful that they even have a podcast devoted to it. Now, we can't talk about thinking like a marketer without talking about advertising. So does your podcast have an advertising strategy? And look, we get it. You may not have an advertising budget to support buying a billboard for your podcast in Times Square. Instead, your strategy may be more like this, and that's okay. The key is to think about it, have a plan, and do what you can to bring in an audience. Having great content is one thing, but you need to attract listeners who will like it. And there's all sorts of different things that can kind of generally fall under this advertising banner. There's traditional media, radio, television, outdoor, and in particular in the podcasting space, you're seeing more and more kind of cross promotion with radio in particular. There's social media, which could be paid, could be unpaid. There's exposure on other podcasts. That's done a lot. That helps spread the word. There's endorsements. You can cultivate reviews. You can engage in public relations activity to get your name out there. You should definitely have a website. You can engage in search engine optimization so that when people are searching, for example, a Stranger Things podcast, they find yours. And there's content marketing. So you could potentially blog, for example, about your area of expertise.
Now, all of these things that John talked about that you can be doing in order to build a brand, using mnemonic devices, benchmarks, advertising, having an elevator pitch, all of those things are highly important. But if you're going to think like a marketer, you also need to understand some of the obstacles that you will face in trying to build a brand. We're going to go through a couple of those that you may not always be considering. The first obstacle that we're going to talk about is very simply time. Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist who lived from 1850 to 1909, who pioneered the experimental study of memory. And he's known for discovering what's called the forgetting curve. In the simplest terms, the forgetting curve shows us that most of what is learned is forgotten over time. So as you engage in all of these marketing activities, and you may be doing things that you think the audience is even tiring of, you should also consider that the audience is often forgetting many of the things that you do. Another obstacle that marketers understand can often get in the way of building a brand is this idea of too many messages. If your podcast is sending out too many messages about what it's all about, what it stands for, that's going to hinder your audience's ability to truly get an understanding of your brand. One of my favorite examples of this is a radio brand. I have no idea who this guy is, but one of my colleagues saw him one day and insisted on taking his picture. Why? Because of the t-shirt he's wearing. He's wearing a t-shirt for a radio station called Magic 101.7. And what does this t-shirt try to communicate to us about this radio station? Well, it tells us that it plays continuous light rock, that it has John Carter on in the mornings, and that it also offers the no repeat workday. Well, if you think like a marketer, you're going to understand that one message plus one message plus one message does not equal three messages getting through to the consumer. Our experience is that maybe when you're sending out three messages, maybe about 3/4 of one of them will get through. What does this mean for you if you're thinking like a marketer of your podcast? Have a very focused and singular message that you try to communicate at any given point in time to your audience. Another obstacle that often exists when it comes to developing brands is a concept called pre-learned interference. Sometimes consumers have a clear perception of something, and then when we try to change it, we can't because that initial perception was so strong. And I'm going to give you an example from the podcasting space of where pre-learned interference could be a factor. A couple of years ago, you may remember that a podcast called Slow Burn debuted. I was turned on to it actually by John, and I loved this podcast. It was an in-depth examination and review of the Watergate scandal, and it was done exceptionally well. I liked it so much that when I started telling other people about the Slow Burn podcast, when I described it to other people, I said, "You're going to love this podcast. It's about Watergate. It's the Watergate podcast." So that was the concept that developed in my brain and that I communicated to other people about what Slow Burn was all about. And Slow Burn didn't do anything to communicate that it was about anything else but the Watergate scandal. That was all fine until season 2 of Slow Burn came along. And guess what they did in season 2 of Slow Burn? They did another political scandal, but this time it was about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. Now, you can argue, all right, that's still within the same area. It's a political scandal podcast, but it was never framed that way in season 1. It was the Watergate podcast. They never communicated it was a podcast that was going to examine political scandals in detail. So when season 2 came along, I would now say, now, Slow Burn, it's a great podcast, but it's not about Watergate anymore. It's about the Lewinsky scandal. So that became a little bit of a problem because people who I'd already told about Slow Burn had this idea that it was the Watergate podcast. Now, you may not be with me on this. You might be saying, this doesn't seem like that much of a stretch. It's still another political scandal podcast. Well, it's going to be real interesting to see what happens with season 3 of Slow Burn, because while it's not out yet, they've announced that the 3rd season of Slow Burn is about the murders of Tupac and Biggie. That's going to be a real stretch from what I have already learned about what Slow Burn is all about. And by the way, I can't wait to learn more about Tupac and Biggie's murder in this analysis, but it's not consistent with my perception of what the Slow Burn brand is all about. So that's a challenge they're going to face in communicating what Slow Burn actually stands for. A fourth obstacle that we'll talk about that might impede your ability to develop a brand is very simply competition, and there's a lot of it in the podcasting space. Here's a very simple example. I'm a huge hockey fan. I can't play it, watch it, listen to it, talk about it, read about it enough. I absolutely love hockey. And I was on Spotify a couple of weeks ago, and I said, I wonder what podcasts might be available on the Spotify platform about hockey. So I entered NHL hockey into their search engine, and just on the first screen alone, 8 podcasts came up right away. How do you stand out in an environment like this when there's 8 different podcasts? So all of these things, competition, pre-learned interference, time, having too many messages, these are all things you need to understand when you think like a marketer and you're trying to develop a podcasting brand.
So the third thing we mentioned early on is that success is not only about downloads. Success is measured by satisfied listeners. That's what an outside thinker recognizes. And so, sure, it's important to get a download. And then we got to convert that download into an actual listener. But then, really critically, we need to do everything we can to make sure that listener is a satisfied listener. It's one thing for someone to sample your product, but if they don't really like it, they're not going to come back, and they're certainly not going to spread the word about it and help you grow. So it's critical to understand what creates satisfied listeners, what parts of your show work, what parts of your show don't work, so you can do more of the good potentially and less of the bad potentially. So to do that, one thing outside thinkers do is they get listener feedback. They welcome listener feedback about their content. And this could be done informally or formally. So, informally would be things like soliciting feedback and reading feedback in listener reviews or email surveys or social media. You can definitely learn from that kind of feedback. Or you could do more formal research like the work that our firm does. But the point is really open your eyes, your mind to creating satisfied listeners. And that means understanding that not everything you do may be a home run. You need to learn and try to improve. So on this point of creating satisfied listeners, we would like to share with you some of the things we've learned that really are kind of broadly apply to lots of different pieces of content. And I'll even share a real specific example of some research we did on one particular podcast to try to bring a particular point to life. Now, in order to get there, I need to first kind of explain the methodology of that particular project so you'll know what I'm talking about. So this example I'm going to give you is from a media EKG deep dive study that we did. The media EKG is one of our content testing tools. And so what we do with this is we recruit a carefully targeted sample of people to listen to a podcast or segments of a podcast and give us in-depth feedback on what they're hearing. What do they like? What do they dislike? Why? And truly react to something granular and give us really specific positive or negative feedback. And so technically how it works is that as people are listening to the audio excerpts, they're giving it continuous feedback using this slider scale kind of example that you see here on the screen. So they may, on a second-by-second basis, tell us what they're liking and what they're disliking from what they're hearing. The end result of a segment would be a media EKG line graph, kind of like what you see here. At the bottom of the screen, that's a timestamp, so 30 seconds in, a minute 30, etc. And then on the y-axis, you can see the average media EKG score at that point in time. So in this particular example, you can see upward growth in interest, but it's not perfectly linear. There's peaks and valleys. There's things that kind of pop interest and things that pull interest down. But overall, this is growing in interest in this particular example. So that's kind of how you read it. Also, we are asking people why they feel the way they do. So we're collecting additional information about why did you rate a segment highly or why did you rate a segment poorly. Okay, so that's how media EKG works. Now, the specific example I want to give you is share some work we did for the Ben and Ashley I Almost Famous podcast. This is an iHeartRadio podcast. Those of you who were at Podcast Movement in Philadelphia last year may be familiar with this because we are fortunate enough to be able to share with the industry some learnings from this particular program. And this, if you're not familiar with it, is a podcast largely about the Bachelor, Bachelorette universe. These are former participants from the show who are kind of known within that area. And largely what they talk about is the show itself or the kind of offshoot shows from the Bachelor, Bachelorette series. Now, the reason we're pulling this up to show you right now in the middle of this kind of section on created satisfied listeners is because this research is a great example of the importance of topic choice. That's what we're going to get into here. So I'm going to show you several different segments from the Ben and Ashley I Almost Famous podcast and give you a sampling of how the audience reacted to these specific segments. So here is the first segment I'll show you. This was a segment on the Bachelor season finale. So this was done last year. So that series was about Ari. And for those of you who are in the know, you would know that Ari's series ended in controversy, where he picked one woman and then ended up changing his mind later on. So this was an episode, a segment from the episode of the Ben and Ashley I Almost Famous podcast where they were recapping the season finale. And so here's the media EKG profile of that particular segment. It is really good. Notice quick acceleration in interest and generally stays at a very high level of interest. Why? What did this segment have going for it? Well, it had a number of things. First of all, it was about The Bachelor. And remember, that's the essence of this particular podcast. People come to hear about The Bachelor. So it was nailing it by talking about the current season of The Bachelor. It was timely. It wasn't talking about last season. It wasn't reminiscing on old times. It wasn't talking about an episode from months ago or weeks ago. It was the post-season finale recap show. It was controversial. As I just described, Ari had a controversial ending, so there was buzz and things to discuss. And it had inside information. As part of the episode, they interviewed people who were on that particular season of the show. So it did very well, and you can see it in some of the open-ended feedback that we got. For example, someone said, I like how they went in depth with a certain hot topic about the show. Someone else said, I like the behind-the-scenes story. And then someone else said, this is exactly what I would expect from this podcast, which we consider high praise as branding people. This is exactly what I would expect from this podcast. So that's an example of a really strong segment of this particular show. Next, I'll show you an example of an interview they did with a former bachelorette. This is Rachel Lindsay. She was the top person on a former season of the show, but it wasn't the current season. This is how her segment performed. It did well, not as well as the first example I showed you, but it did well. Now, you may notice that it lagged a little bit toward the end. There was a little bit of weakening there toward the end. So what was happening at that point is the conversation veered from talking about her bachelorette experience to talking about what she's up to now, which is sports broadcasting. And so while that may have been somewhat interesting, it moved a little further outside of the core topic lane of bachelorette talk. And you heard about it a little bit in the feedback, such as, I like hearing what Rachel was doing, but sports talk was just boring. Let me give you a third example. Who the heck are you? So this is kind of a fun way that they handle people who are in the orbit of the show, of the Bachelorette show, but not necessarily at the center of it. This is someone who was not the key part of a series, but was a contestant in the show. Her name was Kelly Travis. Her name is Kelly Travis. She was in season 18 with Juan Pablo. So who the heck are you is kind of their fun way of handling someone who may not be a recognized person completely to the Bachelor universe. And this particular segment did well. Again, not as well as that first segment, but it did pretty well. And people said, I liked hearing updates about previous Bachelor and Bachelorette contestants. Now, let's start to stretch the brand a little bit. This next segment was a tale of two content pieces. The first part of the segment, they're talking about The Bachelor with Ari. They're talking about the show. The second part of the segment, they transitioned to talking about Ben's trip to the Masters with his dad. It was a lovely story. They bonded. He was very passionate about it. It was a great time for him. It was good audio, I would say. But when we tested it with the audience, I think you can probably see where the transition occurred. The back half here was nowhere close to as enticing to the audience as the first half. And so we heard things like, the beginning sounded like a podcast that I was going to be interested in. Then Ben started talking about golf. His talk about golf might have been interesting. It might have been compelling. It might have helped connect the audience to Ben as a person, but it was a little far afield from why they're coming to the show, a little far from that core topic lane of the Bachelor, Bachelorette universe. And finally, the last example I'll show you is a segment that had nothing to do with The Bachelor or The Bachelorette. It was them talking about the movie, The Greatest Showman. The Greatest Showman had just come out, and Ashley saw it and loved it and raved about it and wanted to talk about it. And she was really passionate about it. Again, I would say it's good radio. It sounded good, good segment, good podcast content. The audience was okay on it, generally positive. And notice the pattern here. You know, they got going, the audience was somewhat interested, and then it faded. But then it kind of picked up toward the end there. So what was happening? People said, I dislike that there was no mention of Bachelor news since that's the topic of the podcast, but I liked hearing Ashley be so passionate about The Greatest Showman. So she pulled it out in the end. It got pretty good toward the end, but at first it just wasn't something that a lot of people were really interested in hearing from this particular podcast brand. So, I think we can plot this particular podcast topic choices on a target. And at the bullseye of that target would be the current season of the show, the current season of The Bachelor or Bachelorette or one of its offshoots. And again, in this particular example, we were talking about Ari's season. There's a high rate of success there. The odds of success are high because that's why people are coming to the show, to hear that kind of talk. Now, a little further away from that bullseye would be Rachel Lindsay. She's not the current season of the show, but she's a big deal in the orbit of The Bachelor, Bachelorette, so people know her, and it was interesting. A little further out from that would be, who the heck are you, Kelly Arnold? More of a secondary player in the program and not of the current season, but still in the Bachelor, Bachelorette world. And then further outside of that core topic lane would be talking about the Masters or talking about The Greatest Showman. And the point here is that the further you get from that core topic lane, the better your content needs to be in order to hold the audience, because they're largely there to hear about what's at the core of your target lane, and they'll have less patience and less acceptance of things that move further from it. So that's a great example of one of what we call the 3 T's of content. Lessons from content research begin with topic choice. You need to understand what your bullseye topic is for your particular podcast. Every podcast has a bullseye, and it doesn't mean you always have to be in that bullseye topic lane, but you do need to recognize that as you expand from it, maybe with kind of secondary topics, topics that have nothing to do with it perhaps, or just general chit chat, you probably will start to lose some of your audience. And so if you're going to deviate, it better be good. Now, another lesson that we've learned from content research is treatment of a topic is important. So treatment means you can take the same topic but handle it all sorts of different ways. Let me just give you a laundry list of examples. Monologue. You could talk about the presidential election, for example, with a monologue or a dialogue with someone else. It could be a broader roundtable discussion, same topic, but different treatment. You could do an interview with someone who's maybe an expert. You could do Q&A with your audience. You could take listener calls, text, emails, see what they have to say on this particular topic. You could run through a list. Here's my advice. Point 1, point 2, point 3. You could have a recurring benchmark. Again, there's all sorts of different ways to treat the same topic. And your brand may be particularly good or particularly bad with certain treatments. And you could have a variety of treatments, just like we talked about earlier with Bill Maher's Real Time, but find the ones that work for you. And the third T is tone. Tone is important. You can talk about the same topic with distinctly different tones, and it'll impact how the audience reacts to it, positively or negatively. So you want to find your tone. So for example, again, same topic, let's say you're talking about presidential politics. You could talk about presidential politics with humor, like a Stephen Colbert might do. You could talk about presidential politics, maybe in kind of a professorial tone, like a Fareed Zakaria might do. Or you could rant about presidential politics in an angry, attention-grabbing way. The point is, find your tone, your voice, and have some consistency with it.
So to recap our presentation today, there are three major points that we want to leave with you. The first is that we really need to teach people about podcasting. Secondly, you should understand that it's not just about great content, but success is about combining great content with strong branding. And third, success should be measured by the number of satisfied listeners that you have. In other words, we're advocating that you should be an outside thinker. We really appreciate your attendance at our webinar, and in a couple of minutes, we're going to answer any questions that you've submitted. Again, I'll remind you that in the panel for the GoToWebinar software, you can enter in questions, and just a couple of minutes, John and I are going to answer a few of them. Until then, I invite you to visit our website, ColemanInsights.com. That's another way you can contact us with any questions that you may have. I will also mention that a recording of this webinar will be posted at ColemanInsights.com in the next couple of weeks. So if you'd like to revisit some of the things that John and I covered today or share the content with some of your colleagues, that'll be a great way to do it. And another thing you could do at ColemanInsights.com is you can sign up for our free Tuesdays with Coleman blog. Every Tuesday, we send out some great content that will help you be an outside thinker and develop great content and build great brands. And with that said, Jay, why don't you hit John and I with a couple of questions that have been submitted by our attendees?
All right, let's do it. The first one comes from Neil, and he says, with topic selection, are you saying that there's no room for brand extension to do something outside your brand?
No, great question. There is just, you need to understand there's a tension there. Tension, kind of the fourth T here with topic selection. The further you get outside of your core lane, the more risk there is. And there's also reward with risk, right? So sometimes you may benefit from expanding, from diversifying. Sometimes you may benefit from personalizing. So for example, with Ben, when he was talking about the Masters, maybe it wasn't great from a listenership standpoint for everyone, but it might have been helpful in terms of personalizing Ben with the audience. So you can expand. We oftentimes talk about thinking about how to logically expand. And again, I think the Ben and Ashley I podcast has some kind of interesting examples of this. So they could have said, the only thing we can talk about is the core current season of The Bachelor and Bachelorette. But to help them expand and insulate them from that, they do things like interviewing former bachelors or former bachelorettes, and then they even expand further by bringing in the lesser known people and kind of doing the who the heck are you thing. So there are ways to stretch your brand beyond that core, because we can't always be talking about the core, but you just want to understand, kind of creatively think about ways to stretch the brand and then understand the potential risks of doing so.
Okay, next question comes from Sophia. She says, with slow burn, how would you have fixed the pre-learned interference? Would it have been by better branding or something else?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a great example of 2020 hindsight. For all I know, when they were first putting together the initial season of Slow Burn, they had no intention of doing anything beyond the first season. But if their vision was to build a podcast that's about in-depth investigations, they could have used language on the air that described what this podcast was going to be about. It's kind of like the example John gave of Malcolm Gladwell having a positioning phrase at the beginning of every one of his podcasts explaining what his podcast is about. If Slow Burn was originally introduced as the in-depth investigation podcast, because now we're going even beyond politics with season 3 of Tupac and Biggie's killings, that's something that could have been part of the vision from the beginning. And I'm not necessarily saying that they made a mistake with Slow Burn or did something bad. Again, we're utilizing 2020 hindsight here. All I'm trying to highlight is that had Slow Burn initially been positioned one way, it might have been easier for them to attract an audience who would be interested in this second and then third season. And that's really what pre-learned interference creates as an obstacle to developing a clearly defined brand.
The next question just came in from Brandon, and he wants to know a little bit more about unaided awareness. So he says, earlier you mentioned a survey you did where you got a read on unaided podcast brand awareness. Was that an online survey? Wondering how much that was affected by the effort it takes to write down every podcast title you can remember. It seems like many would just write the top one or two off the top of their head.
Absolutely. It was done online. We interviewed a nationally representative sample of 18 to 64-year-olds, all of whom told us that they listened to podcasts on at least a monthly basis. And then we had a very simple open-ended form where they can write in as many podcasts as they wanted to that they were aware of. Most of our respondents gave us at least 3 entries in that space. But what was striking to us was how fragmented the responses were. And that's not terribly surprising when you consider the nascent nature of this industry and the fact that there are 700,000 active podcasts. But the fact that no one podcast did better than the 14% performance of Joe Rogan, we still think is highly indicative of the lack of brand development in this space. And that doesn't mean that's not going to change over time, but it really highlights the challenge that this industry faces with brand development.
Let's see. John is wondering if you have, you guys talked about advertising a little bit. He wonders if you have any thoughts on advertising in the App Store or any better places to advertise a podcast.
I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I think the point that we're trying to make about advertising is that if you are just putting your product out there and you don't have a plan for utilizing many of the different tools that John talked about, whether it's traditional advertising, social media, SEO, endorsements, etc., you're going to have a real tough time building a brand. It could be that advertising on a podcasting app is an effective way of raising awareness and developing a brand. I think it's going to be very different for every type of podcast. Our whole suggestion is don't just jump into podcasting thinking that if you put great content out there, people are going to find it and listen to it. You need to develop a brand in order to get that traffic to begin with.
All right, excellent. I think we've reached about time. There's a couple more I think that we can do. I'll hit them with a message online, but I think we've covered just about everyone.
Fantastic. Well, again, on behalf of John and Jay, this is Warren, thanking you for attending our webinar today. We hope you found our content to be valuable. And again, if you have any additional questions about things we covered, you can use the contact page at colemaninsights.com, and we'll be happy to respond to your questions. So thanks again, and have a good day.